In this episode, we're going to be talking about the shocking truth about genetically modified organisms, better known as GMOs. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome to the Ewell Acres podcast, where we are rooted in nature, using examples from nature with the aid of modern technology to help us garden. I am your host, Bryson Ewell. In today's episode, we're going to be taking a deep dive, taking a look at genetically modified organisms, which is more commonly known to a lot of people as GMOs. Now, this subject of genetically modified organisms has become very, very heated, both politically and financially. There is a large battle going on in a lot of the Western states right now. It is not a surprise to go and look in the news and see a new law that's been banned by the European Union, by the United States, Canada, of how they are going to dictate what plants you can grow, how you can grow, both the legalities behind it, the finances behind it, and also the political aspects behind it. It has become a very, very charged topic. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, is talking about the genetically modified organisms and what is the good, the bad, the ugly, and a lot of the shocking truths behind it of why it's developed throughout the years that a lot of people don't know about because this subject has been clouded in political ambiguity. So typically, first what we want to take a look at is what is a GMO, a genetically modified organism. Now, the actual definition of a genetically modified organism is as states. A genetically modified organism, GMO, is an animal, plant, microbe whose DNA has been altered using genetic engineering techniques. So this definition that we're given of GMOs sounds really sci-fi, scary, and it's going to be the end of the world because you're creating a mutant that's going to go crazy. You're going to have the next mutant car-eating plant that we see from Mario Kart, where you have this giant, lovely plant walking along, having a good day. All of a sudden, the flower turns into a giant man-eating flower that's just going to gobble you up. That's not entirely true. So, this is what a GMO is. All it basically means is a plant, animal, or thing that has been altered not through natural selection process in nature. We'll talk about that a little bit later, what that means of an animal being modified by pressures of nature versus pressures by man. A man is going to modify an animal, a plant, to suit the needs of a human. We'll talk a little bit later in the video about how mankind has purposely bred dogs. Do you think in natural, out there in nature, a Chihuahua is going to be the primo animal ready to go? No, it's going to be a wolf. There's a reason why a wolf has been created through natural selection, through the evolutionary process of an animal, and a Chihuahua did not. They have very different skill sets, very different strengths that allow them to survive in nature. That is the exact same nature when it comes to plants. They're plants that have evolved over years to coexist with other animals to survive out in the natural spaces. Whereas there's other plants that have been developed for the use of mankind. There are plants that exist today, like corn, that there's no examples of them in nature. Corn exists solely because man purposely worked on them to better benefit our own kind. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the podcast as well. How is a GMO created? There are several different processes how a GMO goes to be created. And there are some techniques that are very simple that have been done for thousands upon thousands of years. And there's other techniques that have only been used within the last 50 to 60 years as technology has allowed us to accommodate those methods. First method that has been used for thousands of years is cross selection. We as humans see a plant that is useful, we like it, we take the flower of that specific trait of that flower and we breed it with the plant itself. We find a plant that has a benefit and we continue to replant that plant for generations until we eventually get something more we like. We have a plant that is going to taste better, that's bigger, that's going to produce more food per seed head. Previously, you'd get a wheat head that's very small, only produce a small amount of seeds. Now, you're getting a wheat head that's going to be, rather than 3 feet tall, it's only 1 foot tall. It's not going to lay over easily in the wind. It's going to stand up nice, straight, and tall, so when your combine comes to cut it, it's going to stand nice and straight, a whole lot easier to harvest, and by having a shorter stalk, it makes it much stronger, not as easily to lay down, much more likely that you're going to get the full benefit of that wheat grain. The wheat grains themselves are going to have a much larger head on it. So the grain produced per plant is going to be significantly greater, stronger than it was, say, even 20, 30 years ago, much less 100 years ago. And so the bushels per acre that you produce off of one region is going to be significantly higher, allowing for a much more productive when it comes to bushels per acre. Now, that's something that's been done for thousands upon thousands of years. We'll give a couple examples of that here in a minute. The next method that you can do is crossbreeding with other flowers, whether that's same species versus some species. It's similar to the self-selected breeding, but there's a slight difference between dealing with a plant that you have with itself versus with a cousin, but they're essentially the same thing. Another method that you can do it is willy-nilly hope for the best. There's a couple different processes how that can work, but essentially what you do is you take a seedling that is at a very young age, and you're going to expose it to some extreme condition. In most cases, one that's really simple is you're going to take nitrous gas, or if you want, you can do nitrous oxide, something else, and you're going to gas a really young plant in a chamber for a period of time. In most cases, it will kill the plant. However, sometimes there are plants that are able to survive that process. And what it does is, if you want to take a look at it this way, it causes the plant to have cancer, and it forces the plant to repair itself, which then could produce a new genetic combination. Now, sometimes that new genetic combination that gets created as the plant tries to repair itself, it's going to allow for a new trait that was not present beforehand. And by doing this technique, you're going to have to go through thousands of plants, tens of thousands of plants, and you might get 100, couple hundred that survive the process and have a unique, gorgeous flower. Now, that same process that you're doing that could be with the old school method where you're cross-pollinating plants. You're going to be doing thousands upon tens of thousands of cross-pollinations to get children. You're then going to find out the trait you want in those children. You're going to cross-pollinate again for the next generation and the next generation. So you're going to have multiple generations with tens of thousands of offspring trying to slowly whittle down and isolate the trait particular that you're looking for. One that's become a little bit more specific in its process now is what's called recombinant DNA technology, or reproductive cloning. Essentially what you're doing is you do a process that is called PCR. And what you're doing is you are mapping out the genetic sequence of a plant. For example, let's say we have a plant that is going to be resistant to a disease. You are taking that PCR process with some DNA markers on it that is essentially a highlighter highlighting the DNA sequence to tell you where does that trait exist within the DNA. Then, through some scientific mumbo jumbo, you can isolate that trait and map it out using the entire sequence. Plants are going to have a trait of they produce delicious fruit. They are more disease resistant. They have a specific trait that we want to continue on that's going to be of benefit for humans. So what you can do is then take that DNA, you can then add it to bacteria and grow it in a bacteria petri dish. You then can take that petri dish and install it into a plant, and then that new seed will become inherent to grow that trait that you're growing. It is a much more accurate way of pinpointing the DNA that you're trying to improve upon. The end result is basically the same that you're trying to get at with doing cross-pollination for thousands upon thousands of plants and multiple generations. You're just doing it on a much more isolated case. The benefit of doing this, though, is you're able to do cross-species analysis. If you're trying to find a trait specific that you want with corn, you have to use just corn species. Let's say there's a specific trait that you want in tomatoes for disease resistant, you're going to have to only work with tomatoes or a similar closely related species that can allow that cross-pollination. With this technique of recombinant DNA technology, you're able to take a plant that you would not normally be able to cross-pollinate with and use that to imbibe a trait. One really great example of this that we'll talk a little bit later is going to be with tomato spotted wilt virus, and how tomato spotted wilt virus disease resistance has been able to be found of a similar disease called tobacco spotted wilt virus within the tobacco plant. However, they're not able to cross-pollinate. By using the technique of recombinant DNA, you're able to take the disease resistance trait that was found in tobacco and install it into tomatoes, so that way the tomatoes have a disease resistant trait for a disease that it would not have otherwise been able to succeed in. Typically, when you think of a GMO in the scientific world, you think of taking a plant through modern technology to help understand it, improve it, modify it, and change it in some way. And in most cases, it's implied that this is change for the betterment of mankind. Rarely do we take something and improve it so that way it can better survive in nature, that it's better adapted to its host environment. In 99.9% of cases, the modification of plants, the modification of animals is so that way it can better suit humankind. That's how all of this is done, is how can I take this item from nature and specifically change it, adapt it, so me as human with my God-given inherited right am going to be better able to utilize it to help me. We as humans in this are very, very selfish. So typically when we think of the GMO, it has a very political different definition. When we think of the political definition, we often think what comes to mind for me is the Dr. Victor Frankenstein and the monster scenario, where you have a Swiss natural scientist who's traveling the world, who seems to be a good guy. Just like the Swiss, they always want to claim that they want to be natural, but yet we know their real history. They are some of the most bad mama jama fighters you're ever going to meet. They have developed such a strong reputation as fighters that the Pope back in 1500 said, you know what? You look like a really bad mama jama. You're a great fighter. You don't have really any major political alliances, so here's a little bit of cash. You want to come join my team? And the Swiss said, cash? Okay. And they came and joined them. So the Swiss came and joined to be the Praetorian Guard of the Pope. And even to this day, the Swiss Guard is still the main guardian you're going to find around Vatican City. Now, shocking, it all revolves around religion. Now, going back to Dr. Frankenstein and the monster, you have a Swiss gentleman who is traveling the world and decides, you know what? I want to help improve things. I'm going to do a little bit better. What can I do about that? I know. I'll go rob some graves. So he goes around digging up body parts and starts sewing them together and bolting them together and creates the monster. What originally is thought as something that I want to do to improve, to help, actually ends up becoming the thing that he didn't want to, a monster that can't be seen. And so the monster actually ends up becoming the good guy, the animal who is the unwitting sufferer in this whole situation. Now, here is another example that you can think of. If you're not really into the classics of reading, let's talk about Lost. Everyone likes Lost. It is a really great convoluted story that has so many twists and turns. It is really hard to follow. But even though it's hard to follow, there are a few things that we know for a fact. You know you're going to find Jack running through the jungle. So you got this group of people, they're on a plane, minding their own business, and all of a sudden, their plane crashes on this great, beautiful tropical island. You got Jack, the great doctor, who he's going to save everyone, and he's always heavy breathing. And then you got Sawyer, who, you know what? Sawyer is really great at giving nicknames to people to piss them off and annoy them. So that's what Sawyer's great at. And then you've got Kate, who's really good at finding alone time with both Jack and Sawyer. So she's very talented. In fact, she might be on her way to having a great bigamy marriage. Having Jack, having Sawyer. You know what? Things are looking good for Kate. And then you got Charlie, a great partier, rocker, who's doing his thing. He accidentally drops his baggie of fun stuff, and he's going around searching for it. He can't find it, so he's really sad. Poor Charlie. Hopefully in the future, he'll be able to sober up and get clean a little bit better. And then you got Hurley. Hurley, you do your thing, man. Hurley, you're all right. The by far most noble, best character in all of Lost. Hurley, you're the man. On that side note, though, you've got this intertwined thing where these characters are trying to survive on this island. And then you have another character on this island. Randomly, there's a polar bear. He's lonely. He doesn't know how to spend his time, so he decides to lift some weights. He's lifting weights, getting strong, minding his own business, when he come across Charlie's own little baggie of fun stuff. And he's like, hey, I'm alone. It's Friday night. Let's party. He gets a little roided up. He gets raged up. He's walking around. He stumbles upon this group of people. And he decides to go on a rampage because he doesn't know what's going on. So Sawyer, without asking questions, he unfortunately ends this polar bear's good time and takes him out. So poor methed up polar bear, he's gone. You know, that would have been a really, really great movie. Other than another movie that I've seen, Cocaine Bear. I like the polar bear version a whole lot better than Cocaine Bear that recently came out. But regardless of that, we have a polar bear that's methed out, roided out, and we have no clue where he came from. You find out later in the series, this whole island is a huge, serious complex of scientists that they are trying to change the world with their vast experiments. Mankind messing in the natural order of things, of God's given creations, that is absolutely horrible. Those are the really true bad guys of this entire scenario. This secret, non-defunct system of scientists trying to play God. That's what politically we think of when we're talking about GMOs. Be the gray wolf to now the huge difference in variations from the Chihuahua to the Pug to the Great Dane to the husky. There is so many varieties of dogs. How did this come about? Man purposely bred dogs to suit their needs, from the hunting dog to the purse dog and everything in between. Now you can think of that this is something that's come about in modern technology. Only in the last 100, 200 years has mankind decided that he wanted to go against the natural order of things and playing God. That is not the case. Mankind has been manipulating nature to suit their benefit since the written word, since we've had spoken language, since we've had written language, and before that, we have records of mankind taking nature and manipulating it into our own use. How do we do that? Well, by far the easiest key example that we have of that is wheat. Wheat used to be a small grass-like substance with small little grains that was basically worthless. It would grow, it would produce seeds, it would continue on. Throughout society, hunter-gatherer nations discovered a grass-like grain that would serve as a good purpose for extra protein. So these hunter-gatherers would gather this grain, harvest it, and turn it into a bread that would be able to hold long term to act as a food storage other than just meat. Over a long period of time, these humans decided that they, rather than always foraging for this stuff, they developed a new system where they would take these grains, they would not eat all of it. They would keep a portion of it back in reserve, and they would plant it in the same location. So as they're migrating from location to location, when they go to plant this grain, they know in this location on their migratory trail, this location is always going to have a large amount of wheat, grass, ancestor that they're going to be able to rely on to help supplement their food source, to help grow their population. Continue on several thousand years, and you get groups that are saying, you know what? I don't want to travel. We can take this grain and we can actually harvest it and turn into a society. So we no longer have to be mobile, we can be sedentary. They start to take grain and develop it into slightly better. They take traits of the grain and they realize, hey, this particular grain here has a bigger head of seed. It produces more of the seed. It has a better flavor. It's more disease resistant. And over a period of thousands of years, they are selectively breeding the grass to become what we know wheat today that is going to be more beneficial to mankind. This exact same example can be seen in by far the biggest change in a plant that you would ever see from old times. Another grass that most people don't think of is corn. The corn that we have today is vastly different from what it was thousands of years ago. Believe it or not, corn used to be a small little grass-like plant that you would find in your suburban lawn. Your Kentucky bluegrass, your Ajoysia grass. Those varieties used to be and still is a cousin of the modern corn. The only difference is that seed head has been developed and modified to better help mankind. That's one of the reasons why you saw this huge civilization explosion in the Americas was specifically due to corn, a high protein food source that you would be able to store for long periods of time over the winter. When you're ready for it, you grind it up and you can make a bread-like substance in order to supplement your diet. These focuses on grains, whether it was rice, wheat, corn, potatoes, those starchy grain substances, whether you look at the Asian civilizations with rice cultivation, whether you look at wheat and rye and barley in the Europeans, whether you look at corn or potatoes in the Americas, every major civilization has had a high caloric intake plant material that they've developed to better suit mankind. You can even take a look at the Aztecs, the Mayans. You have plants like quinoa that is going to be very specifically developed for the high Andean nations, for them to develop to have a high caloric intake to help them out. Every major civilization can be directly brought back to the fact that they were able to conquer agriculture. They were able to take a plant, animal from nature and modify it to better suit mankind. So no matter what you think of, if you claim that you're eating material plants that are heirloom or non-GMOs, you are flat out lying to yourself. Anytime mankind takes a plant, a material, to modify it for their own benefit, technically speaking, that is a GMO. So every single plant in the world that we know of today is vastly different. Now, why am I making that claim? Because in nature, there is a process called genetics, hard knocks. Nature is going to decide what lives and what dies. There is going to be a process that develops that is going to specifically shape the plants, how they grow, the traits that they have. And we first greatly came about this and discovered it through a man by the name of Darwin. Darwin is a very famous naturalist that is traveling the world helping to draw photos, helping to name plants, with the sponsors from Europe. While traveling through the Galapagos Islands, Darwin noticed that there were many different finches. Some had small beaks, some had large beaks, some had long beaks, some had thin, narrow beaks. And he tried to figure out, why is it that this finch, even though they all look very similar, we are able to conclude that they all have a very common ancestor. So how is it that this one common ancestor of the finch that eventually flew over to the Galapagos Islands, how is it that there's so many different varieties that's so drastically different? Well, let's take a look at it. You have finches that have really small beaks. They specialize in eating really small seeds. You have finches that have really big beaks. Well, they're going to have more crushing power. They're going to be able to eat larger seeds. They're going to be able to eat seeds of plants that have harder shells. You're going to be able to eat some fruits. You have some finches that have really long, thin, narrow beaks. Well, just like the hummingbird that has a very small, narrow, thin beak, they're going to specialize in sucking the nectar out of a plant. The plants are very different as well. The plants have developed to have a co-symbiotic relationship with a lot of these animals. Why is it that a plant takes the energy to produce a flower? Why is it that the plant takes time to produce nectar? That is because over a long period of time, plants, through process of elimination, natural selection, found out that if I have an animal eat me, then the seed will go through the digestive tract, poop, and that poop will act as fertilizer with the seed to help the plant be jump-started on the next generation. Or I can help the animal, whether it's an insect, a bee, I can take some pollen, the insect or the bird comes, lands on me, it pollinates it, has some of my genetic material, and then it can pass on to the next plant. That's how nature procreates. They use the process through pollen, through that. Others, just like wind, they use the wind to help spread the pollen. Either way, these processes have developed over millions of years in order to help spread the genetic material of these animals, of these plants. So that way there can be as many as possible of this particular species, cover as large of an area. That's the whole point of life, that you want to be as prolific as possible. So that way you can be as strong as possible. That's what Darwin figured out. We continue on a little bit further of the modern geneticist. Now, this by the name of Gregory Mendel. Now, go figure, he's a priest. It turns out priests in older days, they have a little bit more time on their hands. They're typically going to be the men who are going to be more classically trained, who are going to be able to read, who have a little bit higher education. That's why whenever you look at these scientific developments, 9 times out of 10, don't be surprised when they're a priest, they're a rabbi, they're a friar. They have that religious background into it. You wouldn't think that science and religion mix, but the vast majority of times, these men of science that we revere to today, they're the fathers of modern science and technology development, in particular genetics, they are men of the cloth, if you will. They're men of religion that take to try and understand the natural world through the eyes of their higher deity. So, where does Gregory Mendel come into this? Well, Gregory Mendel is out in his garden having a wonderful time enjoying gardening. And he realizes, you know what? Some of my peas are green. Some of my peas are yellow. Some of my peas are smooth. Some of my peas are wrinkly. And he realizes that his peas that he's growing have different traits. And they start to develop these different traits over a period of time. And so through trial and error, he ends up doing what's called selective breeding, where he will purposely take a small brush and dust the flowers of the pea leaf with other flowers, and he's developing them to see if he can make and understand why some peas are green, some are yellow, some are smooth, some are wrinkly. And he ends up coming up with 3 rules that he talks about. So the 3 rules that he talks about are the law of dominance, the law of independent assortment, and the law of segregation. When you take these 3 laws of Gregory Mendel, they are technically definitionally separate, but they do have 3 solid cores. And if you were to simplify them, it would be as this. You are going to have a parent, typically 2 parents that both have their own separate genetic traits. When they breed together, those genetic traits then get passed on to the child, the progeny. And so the progeny may have similar traits, or they may have slightly different traits than the parent. But you're going to have a combination of both parents to get the child. In most cases, that child is going to look very similar to the parents. There are times where there is a recessive trait that is not physically apparent with both parents, but can pronounce itself in the child. For example, you have one parent that has brown hair, one parent that has blonde hair. They end up having a child. That child has red hair. Neither one of the parents has red hair, but both parents have a recessive trait of red hair gene. And so, because red hair is a recessive trait or not dominant, but both parents have the ability to have red-haired kids, when they combine, it produces a much higher chance that that red-haired kid becomes produced. Now, when taking a look at this, it is very simple to have this across all traits. And that's just an example with humans. You have many different traits. You have eye color, hair color, height, weight, gender. All of these factors are combined together to produce the next generation. How does that law of Gregory Mendel affect us today in modern technology of the GMO? This goes back to the discussion that we had earlier, talking about the importance of mankind and taking something and utilizing it for our own benefit. We talked about how every single civilization has grains that are better able to help them out. We have always taken something to better help and manage mankind. So we take something that we want to help us out. So throughout mankind, you have plants that have been developed for our use. You have a lot of varieties, in particular of tomatoes. There are thousands upon thousands of different varieties of tomatoes. And you are going to have varieties that are called heirloom tomatoes. Now, these varieties are going to be very popular for modern day. And the reason why they do that is because they are what are called open source pollinators. So even though mankind for thousands of years have been specifically breeding these tomatoes, they have been specifically breeding them for taste, for disease resistance, through try and error over thousands of years. We've always tried to improve the tomato, whether it can be taste better, it's bigger, it is more disease resistant. There are traits that we look for to try and develop when we breed tomatoes. Now, what makes an heirloom tomato different than a modern GMO tomato? Well, that gets back to the term of open source pollination. When you're dealing with open source pollinated heirloom tomatoes, for example, you are very easily able to save the seed of that plant. Now, how this works is you take the tomato, you eat it, you take some of the seeds, and because there has been so much across the board breeding, if you want to call it that, with other tomatoes, you're going to have a similar tomato of the next generation. So even though a mom and dad have a kid, that kid is not going to be exactly the same as the parents. But you can expect that kid to have very similar traits as the parents. And you're going to be able to continue those traits on generation after generation after generation. So when you get an heirloom tomato, you are going to have much higher success saving the seed of that tomato and growing it to get a very similar tomato of what you had the season before. When you do this with a GMO or a modern breed tomato, you're going to not have the same results. So how these more modern species of tomatoes came about is you have someone, individuals, companies, institutions, whoever is doing the determined breeding, they're going to be looking for a very specific trait in tomatoes. They find a desired trait that they want, and then they're going to breed that tomato to pass that exact same trait on to the next generation. Then they're going to do it again, and they're going to do it again, and they're going to do it again. And they're going to continue to breed that tomato with itself until they can consistently, year after year after year, get that exact same trait. However, this does have a very, very bad consequence that unfortunately is bad about GMOs. When you are doing tomatoes, and any plant for that matter, so much you end up getting inbred. You start to have issues that pop up. The kid is no longer going to be from the parent. So if you try and save seed from that tomato and try and pass it on, it's going to be completely different than the parent, and you're going to have very huge traits. And it can also have another side effect. When you do a lot of inbreeding, you're going to cause genetic defects and issues that are going to crop up. A very key example that you can see of this is with dogs today and the different species. Mankind has bred dogs for very specific traits that they want in them, and they have inbred those dogs year after year after year to get that specific continued trait. Unfortunately, that has caused other issues with the dog. With a lot of those quote-unquote special dog species, if you're looking at German Shepherds, Rottweilers, Chihuahuas, Pugs, all these different breeds have their own consequences of those included. You want to get a good military dog like a German Shepherd or a Rottweiler? Well, guess what? Because they've been so much inbred, they're going to have major hip issues, and it's going to shorten the life of that dog. So you want to get a dog that's going to be a little bit smaller, that's going to be good for going down into tunnels to chase foxes. Well, ta-da! You got the pug. And that pug has a very small, stout, short face. Well, guess what? That stout, short face has no nose, has no nasal capacity, and that pug forever is going to sound like a small kid who can never get their inhaler going. And they're always going to be wheezing. There are always negative side effects of this genetic testing, this genetic manipulation of doing a bottleneck in the genetic realm. This bottleneck issue that we see in animals can also be translated into what is visible with plants and how humans take issues that we see with plants and try to adapt them to better suit our needs as well. Let's take the example of the tomato. One in particular that has utterly devastated the tomato world is what is called the tomato spotted wilt virus. Now, this tomato spotted wilt virus does not make the fruit itself unedible. Nature never really cared about this because the seeds are still able to produce, the plant itself is still able to produce, but it has lowered productivity, it has lower goodness to it, and it can destroy anywhere between 40 and 90% of the crop. We as humans don't like this disease, it's not as helpful. We have the thrip that spreads the disease. And so, what we do as humans is we decide we need to find a tomato that is more disease resistant to the tomato spotted wilt virus. So you have companies, you have institutions, and universities where millions upon billions of dollars have been pumped into the tomato industry to try and defend against the tomato spotted wilt virus. Well, it turns out that a close cousin of the tomato is tobacco, ironically enough. And they have a disease called the tobacco spotted wilt virus, which is close to the tomato spotted wilt virus. Well, they found out that the trait for tobacco has grown really, really resistant to thrips. And that's why tobacco has developed nicotine, because it is a natural bug insecticide to kill thrips. And so what used to be a horrible disease for tobacco is no longer a horrible disease because nicotine through nature naturally developed to be a really great natural insecticide. And so when you take the tobacco, we as researchers took a look at it and said, you know what? Tomatoes and tobacco are really closely related. Why don't we see if we can breed the two together so that way we can get the disease resistance of the tobacco with the tomato spotted wilt virus, but yet we still have the delicious fruit that we have. So when The Simpsons come out and they have a new episode of developing tobacco, you have no idea just how actually true that is. We have taken tobacco and bred it with tomatoes so that way it can be more disease resistant against the thripped bug. So Homer was right. Homer was innovative. With the development of tobacco, he was able to save the tomato industry. So you have a tomato industry just for the United States, which is worth anywhere between $700 and $900 million on an annualized basis year over year. And that's just the United States. When you're talking worldwide, that is just tomatoes alone, whether you're talking about fresh tomatoes, sauces, or canned, there is billions of dollars in revenue that is earned every year just in tomatoes. So billions of dollars has been put into trying to develop disease resistance for the tomato spotted wilt virus. Now it's going to be for our question of the day. Our question of the day is from Becky. Becky says, I've been growing tomatoes for a couple years now. Every year for the last couple years, I've been getting these bruises, brown spots that are on the bottom of my tomatoes, as well as I end up getting some tomatoes, ringlets, and other bruising throughout the entire tomato. What are these and what can I do to help prevent them? Well, Becky, that question is actually directly related to what we're talking about today with the tomato spotted wilt virus. Now, I don't have photos, I haven't seen things, so I can't tell you what it is. But from your description, there's going to most likely be two main things, most likely what it's going to be. If these bruises or small spots are typically going to be on the bottom side of the tomato, then it could be a lack of nutrients. This could be what's called blossom end rot. And what this is it is primarily a deficiency of nutrients. You're going to be looking at magnesium, you're going to be looking at potassium. Those are going to be the two main things to help prevent that. So what you can do is you can find a fertilizer substitute that is going to help improve the potassium, the magnesium, the phosphorus in your soil to help it out. By having a lack of this magnesium, it is going to help combat blossom end rot. Now, unfortunately, once you get blossom end rot, your tomatoes have blossom end rot, and there's nothing you can do about it. The only thing you can do is pull that tomato off. The good thing about tomato or blossom end rot is it only affects individual tomatoes. So if you give the tomato the required nutrients that it needs, then you can help to improve the tomato. And in a couple weeks, ideally, you won't have blossom end rot on your tomatoes. Now, the second thing that it could potentially be is the exact same disease that we are talking about. It's going to be tomato spotted wilt virus. Now, unfortunately, tomato spotted wilt virus is utterly horrible. There is no absolute way that I know of that you can get rid of tomato spotted wilt virus. The only cure that you have for it is going to be to burn the plant entirely and hope it doesn't spread to your other tomatoes. When you go to prune your tomatoes from the suckers, make sure you're sanitizing your clippers so that way you don't potentially spread the disease from plant to plant to plant, because it spreads via contact through insects like thrips in particular. And if you're using pruners or clippers on tomatoes that are infected with tomato spotted wilt virus, when you go to prune those, then you're just passing that disease on to the very next plant. Now, there are some cultural practices that you can do to help also prevent the spread of this disease. There are some diseases that live in the soil year after year after year that develop into a commonality because they have the exact same host. What you can do to also help prevent and combat this disease is implementing a cultural practice that's called crop rotation. What that means is you want to not plant the same plant or same species of plants in the same family in the same area year after year, because bugs, hosts, diseases, they like to spend time in the same place. And if they are able to have a host for the next generation, they're going to continue to survive. So in particular, with our example of tomatoes, when you plant tomatoes, you don't want to plant tomatoes in the same spot year after year after year. You also want to find out what other plants are in the tomato family and not plant those there as well. So, for example, peppers. Peppers are going to be in the same family as tomatoes. And so, what you want to do is plant a different crop other than tomatoes, peppers, eggplant in that exact same area. Instead of planting tomatoes, plant a root crop, plant some onions, plant some carrots, plant some lettuces, plant some corn. You want to plant something that is a different species, a different family, to break that cycle so that way it can continue on. I hope this helps you out today, Becky, and good luck with your tomato growing needs. By far, it is one of the most delicious, popular fruits in the world that's grown. We have tried to create disease resistance in plants year over year over year. Mankind has been trying to do this for thousands of years. And that's why it's become a benefit to mankind is without GMOs, without us genetically modifying these plants, whether you're doing it by hand with a paintbrush to develop new flavors, with flowers to get a new pretty thing, we as mankind do it all the time. You, in your own garden, develop genetically modified organisms on a regular basis. You purposely take fruit that's the largest, the tastiest, that's best looking, and you save a little bit of that seed and you replant it next year. You're doing the exact same thing that our ancestors did for year over year over year. So it has a great benefit. That's what the scientific community, the naturalist community, is trying to achieve. It's trying to make plants that are more disease resistant, that taste better. Now, this has a good benefit of having better tasting, more disease resistance. Well, there's another benefit to the creation of these things. Through modern technology, we have developed the use of insecticides. Mankind, through its use of our insulation and smoking of tobacco, realized that it was a natural insecticide. So, in particular, the Aztecs, the Mayans, they would take nicotine, they would take tobacco, they would crush it up, and they would soak it in water for days on end. And they discovered that this nicotine soaked water served as a natural insecticide. And so they would take this insecticide, nicotine soaked water, and they would spray their potatoes, they would spray their corn, they would spray their other crops, and they were able to develop a insecticide to help fight against buggy boys eating their crops, destroying them, so that way they can save more for winter, so that way they can continue to live and not starve to death, as the whole civilization and culture became dedicated upon saving crops and eating it. Yes, they're still pastoral. Yes, we do have meat, we have other things, but by and large, the main caloric intake from these civilizations came from grains. And it's through the use and discovery of things like tobacco and the development of nicotine that we're able to save that. Well, that has developed into modern day where we synthetically produce these chemicals. There's not enough tobacco. There is not enough natural insecticides in plants in the world that could cover the needs of modern technology, of modern humankind, of what we need to protect plants. And so, through the use of technology, have developed synthetic insecticides in order to better help combat these plants. Well, this has a very tragic downside. The key first example that I think of is DEET. Back in the 1940s, we're having massive grasshopper infestations that's wiping out the high Great Plains, that's causing people to have huge starvations within the United States. You have the Great Potato Famine. These buggy boys and diseases are utterly destroying crops that are causing millions of people to starve to death. So, through the use of modern technology, we were able to develop synthetic insecticides, synthetic diseases to help combat these evils that are plaguing us. Well, there's a downside to it. Some of these are very bad for the environment. Some of these are very caustic. And there is literally millions upon millions of gallons of pesticides, of insecticides sprayed on our crops every year, completely dusting it. That is an overkill that is absolutely horrible for the plants. Well, by taking plants and developing them to try and become more disease resistant, to try and become more insect resistant, you are significantly reducing the amount of pesticides that the modern farmer has to spray on his plants in order to receive a good crop, so that way he can sell it to make a living for his family, so that way the civilization can grow food so it doesn't starve to death. By having these modern plants specifically bred to help us out, that is able to allow our civilization to survive. Without the development of these modern synthetics, our whole world would utterly collapse. Now, there are ways around it. By far, one of the best insecticides that I absolutely love, that is from organic nature, is what is called neem oil. Now, there's a plant in the tropics that is called the neem tree. Through trials, we discovered that the neem tree produces a oil called neem oil, and that is a very good natural insecticide to kill these insects that ravage these trees in the tropics. Over millions of years, it naturally developed a defense mechanism. We were able to discover this natural defense mechanism and harvest it for our own benefit. And so now we have neem oil, which works as a really great sedative side note to help control bugs, so that way we can have a higher production of food for our civilizations. Now, doing genetically modified things is not all fun and games. It is not all sunshine and roses. You can go too much. And that's where the political downside has become very, very heated debate. There are some companies, in particular, Monsanto, has hit major headlines in recent years because they have spent tens of billions of dollars in the development of new, higher grade productive plants that are going to be Roundup ready. So you could have a plant like corn that's naturally going to be dead when it encounters a natural killing agent like Roundup, or glyphosate as it's commonly known, will utterly wipe out the crop. Well, Monsanto made corn disease resistant. So that way, or not disease resistant, I should say, but Roundup resistant. So that way, you as a farmer can go spray your field with Roundup and be perfectly fine and happy having a crop to continue to grow while killing all the other weeds. Well, that kind of has created a problem because as farmers over the past 50, 60, 70 years, glyphosate, Roundup, as a name brand is used, has become the industry standard to be used to control weeds. Well, over a period of time, you have decades upon decades of decades where you have a heavy natural factor that is breeding out plants that are susceptible to this Roundup. And so, over a period of natural selection through decades and decades, you have these weeds, you have these plants that have become resistant to this chemical Roundup. And so now you get into this age of what you're calling super weeds. And so you're having to use higher and higher concentrations of this Roundup in order to get the exact same results. And so by trying to develop new plants that are going to be help us out, we've ended up shooting ourselves in the foot to have a product where we have super bad guys. So you have this dichotomy where one becomes reliant upon the other, but because one is reliant upon the other, they continually get better and better. It's also another example is the age-old adage of attack and defense. In olden days, you had swords, you had knives. Well, they didn't want to die, and so for a period of time, you would have defense improve, where you would get leather, you would get bone, and you'd want to defend armor to help make it so you would not as easily get hurt. Well, over time, you would get these technological ages where for a period of time, armor would be better than weapons. And then for a period of time, you'd get weapons be technologically better than armor. And even modern day, militaries and other institutions are continually trying to improve. That's how you got the development of the bow and arrow. That's how you got the development of, before we had the atlatl, perfectly fine. But then you had defense that improved. So you ended up getting melee weapons that are a little bit stronger. Well, you wanted to be able to defend against melee weapons, so you get distance weapons. The bow increased, but then armor was able to improve against the bow. And so you develop the gun that can then defeat the armor. And then for a long time, the gun had a much higher upper hand over the armor. Now you get Kevlar, you got other ballistic plates, and you're going to have this constant back and forth battle between what is going to have dominance. Just like that in plants. You have the Roundup, you have the corn, you have the weeds. There's going to gradually be that constant upping. The weeds become more resistant to Roundup, so you've got to up the concentration of Roundup that you have to use. Well, then it kills off the weeds, then they become more resistant. And so you end up developing and creating your own worst nightmare. You end up creating your own problem. That's where this road of GMO production has to go. Because the more you improve, the more resistance or more these other traits are going to grow. And so there's going to be that battle of constantly using technology, trying to improve plants. And the idea and the hope is that you're always going to be one step ahead of natural selection. That's where the down part comes in. At this point in time, where we have the battle between technology and natural selection, the first thing that comes to my mind in thinking about it is a great quote by Jeff Goldblum in the series Jurassic Park. He's talking with the local scientists while they're creating the dinosaurs and so excited that they brought back to life these great lizards that dominated the world. He looks at them and said, "You know what? You were so excited about the ability to create these animals, you didn't stop to think, should we do it?" So that's where the dilemma comes in today. Yes, we do have the technological ability to do it. Yes, there are great benefits of creating these plants, but ethically speaking, should we do this? Now, I am one of those people that sits on the fence. A good portion of my career, my technology, has been dedicated to the development of these plants so that way we can better utilize them for nature. I see the great benefits that we can do from it. By creating plants, crossbreeding, we are able to create plants that are more disease resistant, that are more resistant to insects, so that naturally they're able to live and grow through the betterment of mankind manipulating them. For farmers to make a profit, for human civilization to continue to live and grow while we eat plants that we produce, we don't have to spend as much money on chemicals. Where the physical amount of chemicals we're placing on plants to control disease, to control insects, is significantly reduced by the use of technology in developing these disease resistance. The thought process must be considered. Is it ethically, morally right for us to do that? Me personally, I take it on a case-by-case basis. Each individual item must be taken a look at seriously to decide whether or not we as individuals should do this. Now, many times you're going to have large corporations, large governmental and private entities that are creating these genetic resistant GMO, whatever you want to call it, plants that are able to be developed. You as the little guy, you as the individual, may feel like you don't have the ability to do that. Well, you actually do have a choice. The reason why companies do this, the reason why governments develop it. So, whether you believe it or not, the way that you can speak, if you want more of these plants, use your money. Buy more of them to help you out. If you don't want these plants, take your money and focus more on spending money on heirloom varieties. But keep in mind, there are positives and negatives to both sides of the coin. What is it about GMOs that's good, that's bad? Well, the shocking truth of it is that the GMOs in the modern system is absolutely necessary for modern life. If we didn't have GMOs, then we as a human race would not be able to survive. We would still be small bands of hunter-gatherers grunting at each other, chasing large heffalumps and woozles with sticks. Because of the ability for mankind to take plants, animals, manipulate them, breed them to better suit our needs so they're more productive, more disease resistant, then that's the only way we have our modern society today. Whether you look at it as a good thing or a necessary evil, the very truth is it's here to stay. Whether you like it or not, GMOs, the development of higher productivity, is here to stay. If we didn't have it, billions of people around the world would die of starvation. One of the great ways about gardening is that we have the ability to grow our own food, to add flavor to it. One of the reasons why civilizations grew and existed and fought over the Middle East for thousands of years is through the spice trade and the Golden Road. Whether that was perfumes, whether that was spices, you have a lot of different spices throughout the world. You have herbs that just make food taste better. It's not going to be bland, it's going to be delicious. You have different fruits, you have different vegetables, you have different root crops that you can grow to make things delicious. I absolutely love growing those in my house, in my garden. I have specifically redesigned my entire house layout from when we got it just so I can accommodate the growth and expansion of more fruits and vegetables. Now, I absolutely love the fact that I've got a couple local nurseries that I can go and order that stuff. However, we don't always have time. We don't always have those options that we can go down to our local nursery and purchase some plants. Sometimes we have to grow stuff from seed, and sometimes it's really hard to find those seeds that you need. It could be the dead of winter, it's hard to find them. It could be out of season, it's high summer, those places are no longer actively growing them, but you still want to get seeds so that way you can store them long term, whether you want to just have them on hand or you're planning your next season of growth. Well, to better help accommodate you in that, I provided a few links in the bottom that you can find some herbs, you can find some fruits, you can find some vegetables. There's some variety packs down there as well. Now, these seeds are probably seeds that you're going to purchase regularly. And I will admit that I get a small commission from these links if you put them on. So you were planning on buying seeds anyway, and this has no extra cost by clicking on the link down below. However, it does provide a small commission to the channel. So if you like what we're doing, if it's gaining value out of this, maybe click on the link to help financially support the channel a little bit through that commission to no added extra cost to you. You can still find ways to better do it. You can find heirloom varieties that have a much wider source. You can choose chemicals or liquids that are going to be more safe for the environment. That's one of the things that we're going to be talking about in next week's episode is what are the developments of these chemicals, whether they're pesticides, insecticides, and what are some things that you can put on your garden that are going to be more in tune with nature, that are more organic to better help you, so that way you're not having to dump gasoline on your garden in order to keep the bad buggy boys away through the development of these insecticides through the petroleum-based products. We're going to show you more natural, more environmentally safe ways to better help care for your plants. And that's going to be through the method called IPM, Integrated Pest Management. Thank you so much today. If you're gaining value out of these videos, if you like what we're doing, if you're watching this podcast via YouTube, please consider subscribing, liking, clicking on that bell for notifications. If you're listening to the podcast through other means, whether it be through Audible, Apple, please give us a thumbs up. Give us that 5-star rating as we're gaining value to give to you through the expression of others, letting them know, giving us higher ratings. It will allow us to gain better momentum in the algorithms, and that will allow us to reach more people, so that way we can continue to learn with each other, help them out, so that way we can stay rooted in nature and help to spread the desire and knowledge of gardening to a wider audience. Thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next time.